You walk through the marble corridors of an ancient palace, your footsteps echoing against stone that has witnessed centuries of human ambition and sacrifice. The air carries the weight of incense and political intrigue, while tapestries depicting glorious conquests mask the complex human realities that shaped imperial decisions. Throughout history, imperial courts operated as intricate webs of power, where individual lives became instruments of statecraft. When we examine cases where family members were repurposed for political necessity, we encounter one of history's most troubling intersections between personal agency and systemic control. Imperial succession practices across civilizations, from Byzantine courts to Chinese dynasties, reveal consistent patterns of how rulers manipulated family structures to maintain power. You must understand that in these systems, individual identity was often secondary to political utility. Sons, daughters, siblings, and even parents could find their roles fundamentally redefined overnight based on shifting political needs. The concept of political marriage extended far beyond traditional arrangements between ruling families. Historical records from various empires document instances where family members were reassigned roles that violated conventional social boundaries, transforming their very identity to serve imperial objectives. These arrangements were rationalized through complex ideological frameworks that prioritized dynastic survival above individual welfare. Consider the Byzantine Empire, where historian Procopius documented court practices in his Secret History, revealing how imperial power could reshape the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Similar patterns emerged in Chinese imperial courts, where Confucian ideals of filial piety created frameworks that could justify extraordinary personal sacrifices for dynastic stability. You witness how these systems created environments where resistance was nearly impossible. Court protocols, religious justifications, and social hierarchies all reinforced the supremacy of imperial will over individual autonomy. The very architecture of these palaces, with their audience halls, private chambers, and ceremonial spaces, reflected power structures that made certain forms of control appear natural and inevitable. The psychological impact on individuals caught within these systems cannot be understated. Historical accounts describe the gradual erosion of personal identity as political roles were imposed. Letters, diary entries, and contemporary observations reveal the profound disorientation experienced by those whose fundamental understanding of self was challenged by imperial decree. Imperial courts developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing the emotional and psychological consequences of such arrangements. Court physicians, religious advisors, and cultural practitioners all contributed to systems designed to help individuals adapt to their redefined roles. These support structures, while perhaps intended as merciful, ultimately served to legitimize and perpetuate practices that violated basic human dignity. The economic dimensions of these arrangements also merit examination. In many cases, the transformation of family members into different roles served specific financial or diplomatic purposes. Treaties, trade agreements, and alliance structures could hinge on these personal sacrifices, making individual suffering appear justified by broader state interests. You observe how documentation of these practices varies significantly across cultures and time periods. Some societies recorded such arrangements matter-of-factly, viewing them as unremarkable aspects of imperial governance. Others treated them as sensitive state secrets, with contemporary accounts emerging only through private correspondence or later historical excavation. The transition from traditional family roles to politically mandated positions involved complex ceremonies and public rituals. These events served multiple purposes, legitimizing the new arrangement, demonstrating imperial power, and creating public acceptance of what might otherwise appear as fundamental violations of social norms. You step into the private chambers where these transformations unfolded, sensing the weight of decisions made in shadows, away from the ceremonial grandeur of public courts. Here, in spaces barely documented by official histories, individuals confronted the reality of their redesigned existence. The concept of agency within imperial systems presents one of history's most complex paradoxes. How does one maintain dignity, identity, and personal will when the very foundations of one's role in society have been fundamentally altered by forces beyond individual control? Historical evidence suggests a spectrum of responses, from apparent acceptance to subtle forms of resistance that historians are only beginning to understand. Contemporary accounts, when they exist, reveal sophisticated psychological adaptation strategies. Some individuals developed what modern psychologists might recognize as dissociative coping mechanisms, mentally separating their imposed roles from their internal sense of self. Others found ways to exercise limited agency within their constrained circumstances, making small choices that preserved elements of personal autonomy. You must understand that resistance took many forms, not all of them immediately recognizable to modern observers. Silent non-compliance, selective interpretation of orders, and the cultivation of private relationships that existed outside the imposed power structure all represented ways individuals maintained fragments of personal agency. These forms of resistance required extraordinary courage, as detection could result in severe consequences. The development of alternative identity frameworks became crucial for psychological survival. Historical documents suggest that some individuals created internal narratives that recontextualized their experiences, drawing on religious, philosophical, or cultural traditions that provided meaning beyond their imposed circumstances. These mental frameworks allowed them to maintain dignity even when external conditions seemed designed to eliminate it. Support networks, when they could be safely established, played vital roles in helping individuals navigate their transformed circumstances. Trusted servants, sympathetic court members, or distant family connections sometimes provided emotional sustenance and practical assistance. However, the formation of such networks required extreme caution, as imperial surveillance systems were often sophisticated and punitive. The question of consent becomes particularly complex when examining these historical situations. Legal frameworks of the time often did not recognize individual autonomy in ways that modern perspectives would consider fundamental. Yet personal letters and private accounts sometimes reveal clear expressions of distress, resistance, or non-consent that challenge simplified narratives about historical acceptance of such practices. You observe how some individuals found ways to influence their circumstances through indirect means. Strategic illness, religious devotion, or the cultivation of particular skills could sometimes modify the exact nature of their imposed roles. These subtle negotiations required remarkable intelligence and psychological resilience, as they had to be executed without appearing to challenge imperial authority directly. The psychological toll of these arrangements varied significantly based on individual personality, previous life experiences, and available support systems. Some historical accounts describe individuals who seem to find ways to psychologically adapt, while others document ongoing distress, depression, or what modern observers might recognize as symptoms of trauma. Cultural and religious resources provided some individuals with frameworks for understanding their experiences that transcended immediate political circumstances. Buddhist concepts of suffering and impermanence, Stoic philosophical traditions, or Christian notions of sacrifice could offer alternative ways of interpreting their situations that preserved elements of personal dignity and meaning. The development of private rituals, secret correspondence, or hidden artistic expression allowed some individuals to maintain connections to their pre-transformation identities. These practices represented forms of psychological resistance that helped preserve core aspects of selfhood even within dramatically altered external circumstances. Communication with the outside world, when possible, became crucial for maintaining psychological health. Letters smuggled beyond palace walls, messages conveyed through trusted intermediaries, or even carefully coded references in official correspondence, allowed some individuals to maintain connections to broader networks of relationship and meaning. You witness how the passage of time affected these individuals differently. Some appeared to develop genuine adaptation strategies that allowed them to find elements of satisfaction or purpose within their circumstances. Others maintained steady resistance or showed signs of ongoing psychological distress throughout their documented experiences. The intersection of personal agency and survival necessities created complex moral territories that challenged simple historical judgments. Understanding these experiences requires acknowledging both the extraordinary constraints these individuals faced and the remarkable ways some found to preserve elements of human dignity and personal will within seemingly impossible circumstances. You enter the grand audience halls, where the political ramifications of these personal transformations played out on the broader stage of imperial governance. The decisions made in private chambers rippled outward, affecting alliance structures, succession plans, and the very stability of empires built on the calculated manipulation of human relationships. The political mathematics of imperial courts required constant recalibration when family members were reassigned roles that violated conventional social expectations. Neighboring kingdoms, potential allies, and internal court factions all had to adjust their strategic calculations based on these fundamental alterations to traditional power structures. Diplomatic correspondence from various historical periods reveals how other courts responded to news of such arrangements. Some expressed shock or moral condemnation, viewing these practices as evidence of imperial decadence or instability. Others approached them pragmatically, adjusting their diplomatic strategies to account for new power dynamics without expressing moral judgment about the methods employed. You observe how these arrangements often created unexpected vulnerabilities within imperial systems. Traditional succession protocols, alliance structures based on conventional family relationships, and established ceremonial practices all required modification when core family dynamics were artificially altered. These adjustments sometimes created opportunities for rival factions or external enemies to exploit newly created weaknesses. The management of public perception became crucial when imperial decisions challenged fundamental social norms. Court historians, official chroniclers, and cultural practitioners worked to create narratives that justified or normalized practices that might otherwise undermine imperial legitimacy. These efforts at historical revision reveal the tension between political necessity and social acceptability. Internal court dynamics shifted significantly when traditional hierarchies were disrupted by imposed role changes. Established court officials, family members, and influential nobles had to navigate new power structures while maintaining their own positions and interests. These adjustments often created new alliances and conflicts that could persist for generations. The economic implications of these arrangements extended far beyond immediate court politics. Trade relationships, tribute systems, and diplomatic marriages all required reconsideration when fundamental family structures were altered. Account records and trade documents reveal how these personal transformations could affect entire economic networks spanning continents. You witness how rival claimants to imperial power sometimes used these arrangements as evidence of illegitimacy or moral corruption. Political opponents could frame such practices as violations of natural law, religious principle, or cultural tradition, providing rallying points for resistance movements or alternative power structures. The legal framework surrounding these practices varied dramatically across different imperial systems. Some courts developed elaborate juridical justifications that incorporated religious doctrine, philosophical principles, or precedential arguments. Others operated through imperial decree without extensive legal rationalization, relying on absolute authority rather than systematic justification. Military implications also emerged from these domestic arrangements. Army loyalty, officer allegiances, and soldier morale could all be affected when traditional family structures within ruling dynasties were perceived as corrupted or unnatural. Military records suggest that some imperial armies struggled with loyalty questions when their rulers' domestic practices violated conventional expectations. The creation of new ceremonial protocols became necessary to accommodate altered family relationships. Court rituals, public ceremonies, and religious observances all required modification to reflect new realities while maintaining the appearance of continuity and legitimacy. These ceremonial innovations often became flashpoints for broader political tensions. International marriage diplomacy became particularly complex when imperial family structures deviated from conventional patterns. Foreign courts had to decide whether to recognize altered relationships, how to adjust their own diplomatic protocols, and whether these changes affected existing treaty obligations or alliance commitments. You observe how these practices sometimes created unexpected opportunities for imperial expansion or consolidation. The demonstration of absolute authority over family relationships could serve as intimidation tactics against potential rivals, or as evidence of imperial strength that deterred challenges to established power structures. The documentation and record-keeping surrounding these arrangements reveal careful attention to historical narrative management. Official histories often minimized, justified, or entirely omitted accounts of practices that might challenge imperial legitimacy in future generations. This historical manipulation created ongoing challenges for later scholars attempting to understand these periods accurately. The long-term political consequences often extended well beyond the immediate imperial generation. Subsequent rulers had to navigate the precedents established by their predecessors, sometimes embracing similar practices or explicitly rejecting them as part of their own legitimation strategies. These decisions could affect imperial stability for centuries. Regional variations in political response reflected different cultural attitudes toward authority, family structure, and imperial legitimacy. What appeared acceptable or necessary in one cultural context might provoke rebellion or moral outrage in another, creating complex political calculations for multi-ethnic or multicultural empires. You walk through the cultural landscape shaped by these imperial practices, observing how art, literature, religion, and social customs all adapted to accommodate or resist the fundamental alterations of traditional family structures. The ripple effects extended far beyond palace walls, influencing entire civilizations' understanding of power, relationships, and human dignity. Artistic representations of these arrangements reveal complex cultural negotiations between official imperial narrative and popular understanding. Court artists often created idealized depictions that emphasized duty, sacrifice, and imperial glory, while subtly acknowledging the human cost of such arrangements. Meanwhile, folk art and popular culture sometimes developed alternative interpretations that preserved space for moral questioning or emotional empathy. Literary traditions responded to these practices in diverse ways across different cultural contexts. Some authors developed elaborate allegorical frameworks that allowed indirect commentary on imperial practices without explicit criticism. Others created works that celebrated the noble sacrifice of individuals for state purposes, contributing to cultural narratives that normalized extreme personal sacrifice for political objectives. You observe how religious institutions navigated the complex moral territories created by these arrangements. Some developed theological justifications that incorporated concepts of divine imperial authority or exceptional circumstances that suspended ordinary moral rules. Others maintained tensions between religious teaching and imperial practice, creating space for indirect resistance or alternative moral frameworks. The impact on women's social roles proved particularly significant, as these arrangements often challenged existing gender hierarchies and expectations in complex ways. Traditional concepts of feminine honor, family loyalty, and social position required reinterpretation when imperial politics demanded fundamental alterations to conventional women's roles and relationships. Educational institutions and scholarly traditions also adapted to these realities, developing intellectual frameworks that could accommodate or critique imperial practices without directly challenging state authority. Academic discussions of ethics, governance, and social organization often contain subtle commentary on contemporary practices, preserving intellectual space for moral reflection and debate. Popular culture developed sophisticated methods for discussing these sensitive topics through coded language, symbolic representation, and indirect reference. Folk songs, stories, and cultural practices often contained layers of meaning that allowed communities to process and respond to imperial practices while maintaining surface compliance with official narratives. The influence on legal and social precedent extended well beyond imperial courts, affecting how ordinary citizens understood authority, consent, and individual rights within broader social relationships. These imperial examples could either normalize extreme power dynamics or, conversely, create reactions that strengthened commitments to protecting individual autonomy in other contexts. You witness how different social classes responded differently to knowledge of these practices. Elite circles directly connected to imperial courts might develop sophisticated justifications or express private concern while maintaining public support. Common people might respond with moral shock, practical indifference, or complex combinations of fascination and revulsion. The development of cultural memory around these events proved crucial for long-term social understanding. How communities chose to remember, forget, or reinterpret these histories affected subsequent generations' attitudes toward authority, family relationships, and individual rights. Some cultures developed cautionary narratives, while others emphasized themes of noble sacrifice or imperial grandeur. International cultural exchange also carried information about these practices across civilizational boundaries. Diplomatic contacts, trade relationships, and scholarly communication all contributed to cross-cultural awareness and comparison of different imperial systems. These exchanges sometimes influenced cultural attitudes and political practices in other regions. The intersection of these practices with existing cultural values about family, honor, and social relationships created ongoing tensions that affected community life far beyond imperial circles. Local leaders, religious authorities, and cultural influences all had to navigate the complex moral territories created by imperial examples that challenged fundamental social assumptions. You observe how cultural resistance sometimes took forms that preserved alternative values while avoiding direct political confrontation. Emphasis on conventional family relationships in popular celebrations, artistic focus on traditional gender roles, or religious attention to individual dignity all represented ways communities maintained alternative value systems alongside imperial political realities. The long-term cultural legacy of these practices varied significantly across different civilizations and time periods. Some cultures developed strong traditions emphasizing individual autonomy and resistance to arbitrary authority, partly in response to historical experiences of imperial overreach. Others incorporated acceptance of extreme personal sacrifice for state purposes into their fundamental cultural values. You stand at the intersection of historical analysis and contemporary understanding, observing how modern scholarship approaches these complex historical realities with tools and perspectives unavailable to previous generations. The lessons emerging from this examination extend far beyond academic curiosity, offering insights into the persistent challenges of power, dignity, and human agency. Contemporary historical methodology brings new approaches to understanding these experiences, incorporating insights from psychology, gender studies, and human rights frameworks that allow more nuanced analysis of individual experiences within oppressive systems. These interdisciplinary approaches reveal layers of complexity that earlier historical accounts often missed or deliberately obscured. The challenge of historical empathy becomes particularly acute when examining practices that violate modern understanding of human dignity and individual rights. Scholars must balance historical contextualization with moral recognition of human suffering, avoiding both anachronistic judgment and moral relativism that fails to acknowledge the profound human cost of these imperial practices. You observe how these historical cases illuminate persistent patterns in how power systems prioritize institutional survival over individual welfare. The specific practices may be historical, but the underlying dynamics, the willingness of systems to sacrifice individual dignity for perceived collective benefit, remain relevant to contemporary analysis of authoritarian governance and institutional abuse. Modern therapeutic and psychological understanding provides new frameworks for interpreting the adaptive strategies employed by individuals facing impossible circumstances. Recognition of trauma responses, dissociation, and resilience offers insights into historical accounts that previous generations of scholars might have interpreted differently or missed entirely. The documentation challenges surrounding these topics reveal ongoing questions about historical truth, institutional memory, and the politics of historical narrative. How societies choose to remember or forget these experiences affects contemporary understanding of authority, consent, and individual rights in ways that extend well beyond academic historical study. You witness how these historical examinations contribute to broader discussions about institutional accountability and the protection of individual dignity within power structures. Understanding how imperial systems justified and implemented such practices provides insight into the mechanisms by which institutions can normalize violations of human dignity when they serve perceived larger purposes. The intersection of personal agency and systemic constraint revealed in these historical cases offers lessons for understanding contemporary situations where individuals face impossible choices within oppressive circumstances. The strategies of resistance, adaptation, and survival developed by historical figures provide insight into human resilience while acknowledging the profound costs of such resilience. International human rights frameworks and contemporary legal understanding provide new tools for analyzing these historical practices, not to impose anachronistic judgments, but to better understand the long-term human costs of political systems that fail to protect individual dignity and autonomy. The ongoing scholarly debate about how to appropriately study and present these historical realities reflects broader questions about academic responsibility, historical truth, and the ethics of historical research. These methodological questions affect how future generations will understand and learn from these complex historical experiences. You conclude this examination with recognition that understanding these historical realities requires both scholarly rigor and moral clarity. The human beings caught within these imperial systems deserve historical recognition that acknowledges both their suffering and their remarkable resilience. Their experiences offer profound lessons about the persistent tension between individual dignity and institutional power, lessons that remain relevant for understanding and protecting human rights in contemporary contexts. Through careful, respectful examination of these historical cases, we develop better understanding of how power systems operate, how individuals resist and adapt to oppressive circumstances, and how societies can work to protect the dignity and agency of all their members. These lessons, drawn from the most difficult chapters of human history, contribute to ongoing efforts to create more just and humane social institutions.